to be able to be here. I'm so pleased to be able to be here with Dr. Bruce Shelby. And thank you to Olivia for the invite to speak at the Samuel Center for Social Connectedness. Again, my name is Joe Desjardins. I'm the BC Métis Federation Director of Research. And we hail from North Vancouver. I'm hail from North Vancouver, British Columbia. I have a family of 5. And Dr. Shelby is from Langley, British Columbia. And we support members and partner communities at the BCMF throughout BC. And you can see the screen here. It's about the BC Métis Federation. It's a nonprofit organization that works with Métis communities to ensure the well-being of BC Métis Federation members. Through grassroots efforts, we advocate on behalf of our many members living all across the province. There's partner communities, there's a board of directors, and then there's staff and contractors. And you know, I can't talk, the saying here is l'état passé, l'état qui vient. From our past, it's in Michif for our future. And preserving our heritage and sharing it with our younger generations is really important for the survival of Métis people and culture. And our focus here today is specifically in the Pacific Northwest. And I can't talk about Métis history without just giving a little bit of a background in terms of my own family history, because we're storytellers at the Métis people. We like to talk about our kitchen culture, and you can probably see a lot of the pictures and images of my family behind me. So I'm just going to toggle to a screen there. It's called My Journey to Métis Identity. And truly, being Métis is a journey. It's a process of recovering identity in community. And for me, you know, I spent my early years around Metro Vancouver, in Millardville, and then in Surrey, and then Abbotsford, all around the Lower Mainland. And my mother was Ukrainian from around Dauphin, Manitoba. And it truly is a mixed culture, because my dad's family comes from St. Lazare in Manitoba, and his dad came from St. Francois Xavier. And both the Métis side of my identity and the European side of my identity, that mixed culture shaped who I am as a person. And let's just see. So we didn't use the term Métis growing up to describe ourselves. I didn't grow up really with an awareness of my Métis identity. Many people experienced racism as they identified as Métis. Now, this is a picture of my great-grandfather, Stanislas Desjardins, and he was they lived as Métis, and they were very relational. We were a visiting culture. And back in the day, I mean, this man and his family really saw the transition from a fur trade economy to a settler society. And there's certainly some interesting stories around his life. The thing about it is our family, this is Francois Xavier, this is that man's son, which is my grandfather. And we come from a big family. My family, typical, I guess you could say, of Métis French families, they're large, and with 10 brothers and 10 sisters. And my extended family was right across Western Canada. And there was deep connections back in Manitoba. And that's part of the thing about being Métis. We're very mobile, and we moved back and forth, and we knew who we were, even though we were oftentimes hidden in plain sight. Well, like for instance, after the war, my family moved to Millardville in British Columbia, where there's a predominant French-speaking community. The reality is that the Métis people were there. They knew who they were, and they knew their culture. My dad and his brothers and sisters spoke a kind of, they used to call it just like a broken kind of a French. Some people called it a dirty French. It was a mixture of French, Métis, and French. And they spoke a lot with their body language. So it was a hard language really to understand in terms of, because I was raised as, well, in Western Canada, predominantly speaking English. My mother was Ukrainian descent, so I never did learn the language, but now, later on, I felt like that was a great loss for me. But it was really interesting watching them speak the language. And we're really relational as a family. It's all about, getting together, and family is really strong. And here's a picture of me when I was young, and there's a typical picture of what we did when we were young. Sorry for the poor quality, but back in the day, this is the only picture I have that can describe our family. We picked up the fiddle and guitar from a young age. There's my father in the middle, my brother and my sister. And we were a very musical family. And it's really amazing to think back at that heritage, that legacy of being Métis. And this is the real epitome of a kitchen culture when it comes to Métis. And there I am. I was accompanied at an early age to play with my dad. He was the Métis fiddler. And this is my family, and going along. I guess you could say I carried on the Métis family, big family tradition. And this is an older picture of my wife and my 5 kids. And I'm very proud of them. The youngest one here, I should have slipped in an older picture, but we don't have a great one like this. He's 14 years old now. Now, my family, again, there's a heritage of music in Manitoba. We see the Canadian Métis fiddler, Andy Desjardins, was a relative, and we were proud of these people growing up. Little did we know that these people had a really strong foundational place in the formation of Manitoba. And that would be a story that would only come up later in our life. And here in the early days, we'd learn how to jig. And jigging is part of the Métis way, the Métis culture. And I hope that these pictures give a bit of an example of what it's like to get out into community and to practice our culture. And we enjoy it. And I don't think my daughter looks that impressed. I mean, but I think she has a cell phone in her hand. That was back in the day when they didn't have really Apple phones, but they got up there. That's my son. He's 22 years old now, my son, Nick. And, at an early age, getting out there in community and just starting to jig. And there, back in the early day, I have to say, and I call it the Wild West of being Métis. When I was in my late 20s, I was offered the opportunity to get my first Métis card. And I didn't understand what it was. And it was from an organization that they've since went defunct. And it introduced me to the idea that Métis could be in community. And that was like not a big concept to us, because we were mostly in our families, living our Métis way as kinship networks and as families. But when I started to realize that in Western Canada, Métis people started to organize because they wanted to advocate for a meaningful existence for their families and for their communities. So I started, in my early days, paying attention and starting to find ways to get into community. And I realized along the way that my family was part of a broader context, and it was a process of back and forth learning, where I wanted to understand my history and where it fit into the Western Canada, some major events like the founding of Manitoba and other events around Louis Riel. And I started to become really impressed and excited, because I realized my family was grounded in these events and happenings. And I started to understand my family and how it related to a broader storied history. And that I became proud as I went through university. It was a process of learning about my culture. And what I did is I started to ground myself into the community perspective. So in other words, what I realized is that the life of being Métis flows out of the community. And because we're so relational, I realized that while I have to introduce my kids and my family to the idea of being Métis and getting to know people. So we just started I met people like Ken Fisher. He was a proud Métis person who was a lead he had a radio show in British Columbia. It was called the Métis Matters Radio Show. He also had a nonprofit local Métis organization in Surrey, British Columbia called Nova Métis. And I started to just go to meetings and talk about genealogy and just get involved and go to events and meet people, meet elders. enjoy things. Sometimes there's cultural events and different things over the years. I bring my kids there, and I realize that families, communities, we like to have fun, we like to get together. And as I started to grow, I realized that it wasn't only just about having fun. We really wanted to enable our communities through community governance to advocate and move toward finding ways to work with governments and industry to have a better quality of life for our members. And part of that is community governance. So you can see, I started to realize that, being Métis is political. There's a political component where we have to work together in teams. We have to work together through our community governance and through other political organizations. There are also provincial, regional organizations, and even national Métis organizations. And being Métis is much like being First Nations in the sense that there are many ways of being Métis, not just one organization. And I've come to realize that over the years, and it is important to us and to me in particular, that as I started to ground myself into the community and started to find ways to express my identity, that we needed to make sure that a community perspective came along with it so that the voices of the local community members could help shape the discussion, whether it had to do with topics like families or health or economic development and all these different kinds of topics. And it really became important to me to make sure, and we got involved in the early days. We were included in Canada Day parades. We did all kinds of things. And it was really interesting to get involved in those early days and find ways to connect into the community and make ourselves visible as Métis people. And this work goes on. And for me personally, I went back to university. I did an undergraduate degree in education, and then I realized I wanted to do further graduate work, and that's partly where I met Dr. Shelby. I started to write because I wanted to find my own unique Métis voice as a public historian. So I started to think about what it meant to be Métis in Canada, how we could really understand Métis identity in a way that it was mostly more reflective of the nuance and the complexity of being Métis in the historical experience. So I started as a public historian to talk about these kinds of issues. And I started to just put my voice out there in different ways. I joined the BC Métis Federation, and I began to write. I began to put my words on paper, and we utilized social media. And this is over 11 years ago now. I've been involved, and for me, it was about finding a way so that Métis could coexist in Canada. They could be fully Métis, and then they could be fully Canadian. And so I started to write about the many ways of being Métis. And I did these different kinds of activities. I wrote letters. We did all these different kinds of activities. Now I want to toggle away from this screen, and I want to go to this screen here. Sorry, I'm on the wrong screen. And what we did as we went along is I realized that Métis have a central role in Canadian history. And I worked as a consultant along the ways. Even before I became involved at the BC Métis Federation, I realized there was very little scholarship. There was very little understanding of Métis people from a Pacific Northwest perspective. Most of the ideas about Métis were informed by stereotypes that Métis only had existed in and through the prairie provinces and the events around the Manitoba Act. Most of us have heard about people like Louis Riel. We've heard about Métis nationalism that flows from the prairies. But what I realized when I went through my studies, and then when I met people, Métis perspectives were invisible in British Columbia. They were oftentimes subsumed into French Canadian identity. Scholarship was preoccupied again with this French Métis from the prairies and the events around that. And there was no scholarship by Métis about Métis in the Pacific Northwest. It was most often written by others. And I realized that Métis organizations have focused on securing money and dollars and recognition because they focus on their prairie base. But I realized in and through that, whether it's the prairie base or the there's also kinship networks and communities right here that in history they have self-determined, they have expressed themselves, they have determined according to place, whether through economic development or by being here on the land and water. And what I started to realize is that we needed to address and rectify this situation because it was wrong, simply wrong for governments and for industry and for Métis organizations to focus on a prairie-based Métis without really understanding and recognizing the historical realities and the lived experience of Métis in the Pacific Northwest. So what we did is we started to look toward finding a way to move into understanding the Pacific Northwest research. We wanted to find a community-based approach because we realized that the life spring of being Métis flows out of the community experience. So as you can see, the slide here, it's the Pacific Northwest Métis research. We started we realized that needed to be our focus because it was important that our communities repatriate this history and that we would work to facilitate that. So about 3 years ago, 2-3 years ago, we started to gather together a team. We, as you can see, Dr. Bruce Shelby along with me and Tanner Timothy from the Sliaman First Nations. And I'm so proud of this team because we've been growing right from the very beginning and we really utilize project work. So we've been engaged in different kinds of projects. And right from the beginning, we wanted to adopt a community-based protocol. So we reached out to people in the communities as part of protocol, and we said, we would like to invite you into a partnership, into a relationship where we would like to partner with you to be able to help you to repatriate your knowledge. And this kind of work, it was slow, it was over time, to the degree that we built relationships with these folks. These folks came on board. We have Roseanne Forget from Terrace, Diane Keller from Kelowna region, Karen Prowse from Fort St. John, and Cindy Wilgosh from the North Thompson. I'm very proud of the work that these community-based researchers do because it's central to our methodology in terms of what we believe, because research comes out of relationships. In fact, some scholars say research is relationships, and that really speaks to our methodology rather than being a top-down extractive understanding of research. Now, the way that we operationalize our work is through projects. So we have, this project is called the Métis Terrestrial Investigations Project. And it's a way of understanding the human activity around the Trans Mountain Expansion Project. And what we've done is we've actually said, look, we're going to work with our communities to be able to gather this knowledge. And there's all kinds of things we're building on. We actually had about 3 years ago, we did a knowledge partnership project with the province. It was our first foray into understanding Métis identity by looking at it in a systematic way through a project. And then in 2020, we began the precursor to this particular study, which was a land and life study. And this is where we did capacity work. And we were continuing on in this project. The idea here is that like we started to realize that being Métis was way more complex than just looking at a person's genealogy. And the idea that we could build community capacity in ways that equip our local leaders to be able to use create dynamic knowledge partnerships to be able to make proper decisions about the land, and that we could operationalize a robust database and archival system. And that's where Tanner Timothy comes along and Dr. Shelby. They've really helped us be able to ground this in an academic context so that it works, and all those kinds of things are important. And Dr. Shelby can talk more about the actual work of kinship mapping. Again, you know, I'll go right through to I say outcomes that happen at the speed of relationship building. And the idea that we could come together and talk about being Métis, talk about it in the context of getting together. I'm not going to spend time so much showing you this, but just to pop over, and I'm going to try and figure out a way to go back to this. I'd like you to see the story map, just so that here's an example of how we model a community begins to model the work. So this is a simple overview of the project and includes sample data sets. And as you can see, this is a way, Métis ways of being and knowing in the Pacific Northwest are understood. We've developed a custom web mapping application and to collect data throughout the province. And ArcGIS Online provides, it really is a really great graphic experience because people can see themselves, community people, reflected in and through the data. So you can see, here's an example. I'm going to walk through just a few examples. You can see some of the ways that we actually enter the data into the actual ArcGIS. There's different tables that relate to different practices, hunting, fishing, and gathering. So if I clicked on the image, you can see that. You can see the three different tables. We have a legend, we have an editing toolbar, and then we have the place where the actual data is input. Now, I want to just click on one or two of these particular, and here it is. You can see once the fields are adequately populated, you can see how the information is presented when a user selects a feature on the map. So let me just click on this. Well, it's already open. You can see, and then I'm going to go to the next page. Just one or two more, and then that'll be it in terms of this. So if I clicked on this particular dot with respect to Hudson's Hope, you can see how the field pops up, and then you can actually click through to see the hyperlink to the resource. So this is archival. This is supported by archival records, in this case, digital records. And to us, that's important because we in one place, the people can come in on an map or whatever, and they can, again, see themselves reflected, and it's supported by the archival record or by oral histories. And I just want to go right through to the end because of time, but I just want to show you how when the community researchers start to see themselves and their activities over time. This is an example of some of the data we've collected from our community researchers during our project. And this is in the terrace region. So again, the researchers come in and they see this map. They can click on each of the points and read through and click through some of the major supporting information. And this is the way they see themselves here, and they can be proud of being Métis because they realize that this represents their lived and their living experience. And so that's about all I want to say about that. But I just want to finish off my component by saying that what we've been doing is we've been building a large bibliography. We've been populating this. We have people working on this, and it's a challenge, but it's an important task for our researchers to move the content from raw data all the way through to a formal bibliography. And that's the kind of work. And as they're learning, it's a process of really feedback and learning. It's an exciting time for them as they get into the archives. You can see here, we actually have a curriculum that talks about the history in the Pacific Northwest. We know from our research, we have over 300 pages, 400 pages of raw data that say that Métis people have a storied a self-determining history right here in the Pacific Northwest. And there are so many examples. And we also learn, the students are learning that Métis also experienced systemic discrimination, and part of which I was talking about earlier that resulted in Métis being invisible in the public narrative of the province. And so the community researchers understand some of these ideas through engaging in this kind of curriculum, and then they get into the archives, and like I just described to you, and then they do data collection where they actually go out into communities and conduct oral history presentations. And that's where Tanner and Bruce come in, because they've actualized a map through a GIS, through tablets and computers. So they just sit with people, and it's amazing what the technology can do. They can gather the knowledge right there in a coffee shop or what have you. Again, always in the context of relationship building. And we have a research portal and blog, and we have oral, and this is where they actually, we have like a social media inward facing page, and then we have an actual blog page on our Federation page. And you can go to bcmetis.com website, and you go to the programs and services, and you can click through to the blog there, and you'll see the idea of what I'm talking about. There's all sorts of different articles that we've been posting. It's a way for our community researchers to find their voice. First of all, in the inward-facing blog, and as they build more confidence, they start to see their words and pictures realized out for the general public and for everybody, and they become proud of being Métis once again. And I'm so proud of the work that they're doing with us. And we're working to build capacity. We're building relationships with archival associations in British Columbia. We're growing, developing relationships with various institutions. We've been working with governments to some degree. We want to look for existing and new partners to help Métis people to repatriate their knowledge so that they can benefit from it, so that they can use it. It ought to benefit the local community. And just a few last pictures, again, to show that, what it's like to be Métis as we go out to these various meetings. And we're proud to meet, I think of Harland, a community leader in Surrey. Here, we're having a community leader meeting with people in Kelowna. Here's Diane Keller from Kelowna, the key researcher, and myself and my wife and other folks. We have allies in community that want to support Métis as they repatriate their local history. And again, this is kind of in the way here, but you can see the idea. The guitar and the fiddle are never far from what we do in community. So, and here's a picture of Dr. Shelby and myself as we've engaged the BC Royal Museum. We're starting to build relationships with the BC Royal Museum and other archival institutions so that we can find a way so that Métis have better access to the archives. And we can understand that and work together to partner in that regard so that the knowledge that's in the archives actually benefits from them as pertaining to knowledge sovereignty, so that Métis control this knowledge, they own it, and they ought to benefit from it. And here's Cindy Wilgosh, and our community rep researcher from Clearwater, Renee Therian from Terrace, and myself. We were in Clearwater at this meeting. We're back to Kelowna. We jump around. We went to a community event where we went into a heritage week, and we set up a table. And I'm proud of the work that Diane does. And we put together displays in terms of what it's like to be Métis in the Pacific Northwest experience. And I'm proud of, again, this is Greg Mazur and the team, some of the team from Kelowna, from their board, their local community, and Keith Henry on the right is the president of the BC Métis Federation, in community to support the community in local events. And here's another picture or two. At this point, we were up in Terrace, British Columbia. And again, there's some of the same team members. We were engaged with Roseanne building relationships with Roseanne Forget, her husband, and others at the community level in Terrace. Again, this one is from Surrey, British Columbia, and we've traveled across the province in various times. More recently, we've had town halls, and this is what you're seeing here. And here's the last image, I think it is. This is, we're just sharing about Métis identity. And this journey for me, folks, started 30 years ago, some of those very pictures that you saw in the beginning of this slide. We want Métis people in British Columbia to find their own unique voice, because being Métis is not only individual, it's collective. And we need to find ways in Canada and frankly across the world to be able to understand these and support these various Indigenous communities, and in our case, the Métis community in British Columbia. And so, and we do other work. One more mention is that we are also branching out into doing housing work, and we just launched Métis at Home Capacity Project, where we're actually working with the same researchers to understand the who, what, when, where, why of housing, so that we can ensure that our communities can appropriately respond to the challenges in and around, in this case, housing. And our philosophy is community-based, relationship-driven. So I think that's all for my presentation. And I want to thank you for the opportunity for me to share. And I guess at the end, we can have opportunity for questions. So I would just like right now to stop sharing the screen. I'd like to introduce my colleague and my friend, Dr. Bruce Shelby, into this discussion, and then we can go from there. Okay, Bruce?
Thanks, Joe. Can everyone see my share screen now? Everyone's good?
Yeah, you're just still in the like speaker notes version.
Yeah, I'll get it to my presenter view in a second. Here we go.
Awesome. Oh.
Everyone good?
Now we can see all of your underneath speaking notes as well.
Well, that's no good.
I know, it's always like the too many versions of how to present in PowerPoint, especially when you're presenting on Zoom.
Is that better?
Fortunately, no.
Same thing?
Same thing. I would go to, gosh, I haven't used PowerPoint in a little while.
Yeah, this is
It might be like if you use two screens, it might be sharing the slides to a second screen.
Oh, so I have to swap screens. You're right. Hold on.
Thank you, Paula.
No worries. This happens to me all the time. It's just my notes. This is what you say here.
That's better, right?
We got it.
Yep.
Good. Thank you so much for whoever offered that help. All right, so I'm going to try and get this done in a few minutes, just because I don't want to take time to, leave some time at the end for questions and answers. My name is Bruce Shelby. I grew up in Treaty 2 territory in Manitoba, and now I live and work, play and worship on the traditional ancestral unceded territory of the Kwantlen and Kotsi people here in Langley, British Columbia. Joe and I have been on a journey with Indigenous research methods, and a lot of what you probably learned about in an earlier session would be described as traditional academic research, where you have quantitative or qualitative methodologies. Qualitative methodologies tend to be a little more open. Quantitative methodologies tend to be a little more restricted in the kinds of data that you collect, but also in the interpretations that you draw from that. Indigenous research methodologies challenge those kinds of ways of being and knowing in the world, because they understand that that is only one of the many ways of understanding knowledge. And that's critical if you want to know anything about IRM, Indigenous research methodologies. It is about, as Joe has I think eloquently stated, it is about relationships first and research second. If you don't get that, you don't have a clue what Indigenous research methodology is about. And because of that, Indigenous research methodologists oftentimes see quantitative and qualitative methodologies on their own as extractive, exploitive, and simply just transactional. They are not relational, because what they allow you to do as a researcher is remove yourself from the research process and simply just treat your subject as an object, right? And so a lot of what's happening in the academy right now is that people are talking about what's calling decolonizing research or decolonizing the academy. Probably all of you have heard of these terms when it comes to understanding how research can be done differently in different contexts. So in many ways, the traditional ways that we've thought of research have been challenged and transformed, in fact, around the research that's being done in and through Indigenous communities. One of the more recent books that I've been reading by Jacqueline Quinless, for example, she actually comes right out, and it's a book on she's writing on healthcare and Indigenous experiences in healthcare. She actually makes the startling claim, and I think she's correct, that traditional research methodology is a form of structural violence in and of itself. So this is a serious matter, and I think for you, those of you that are just beginning this research process, you need to recognize that the racialized, marginalized, stigmatized communities that you all are researching, their voice is central to what you are doing. And if you simply take their voice, you borrow their voice or borrow their information or borrow their history or borrow their memory for your own purposes to suit your own research agenda and needs, you are being unethical, right? And so that is the relationality is at the very core of what Indigenous research methodologies is all about. So let me just go through here and see if we can learn a little bit about what then community-based research is all about. Because for me, it has become an avenue towards and a realization of self-determination. Okay, an avenue towards and a realization of self-determination. And so that self-determining future for Indigenous communities, but I would argue for all marginalized, racialized, and stigmatized communities. So a lot of you are doing research on persons of difference, for example, intellectual, physical, genetic difference. Some of you are doing research in Indigenous communities. Some of you are doing research with the LGBTQ+ community. I mean, all of these are communities that have had their voices taken and used in ways that do not suit their own benefit or for their own needs. And that's, I think, of critical importance if we're going to start thinking about how we're going to decolonize research in ways that create sustainable, ongoing knowledge partnerships. So that's the first thing, right? Sustainable, ongoing knowledge partnerships. How are we going to facilitate the repatriation of history and memory, not only to land, but also to peoples and places? That's a second major component. Understanding and honoring the unique ways in which that community relates to each other. In Indigenous research methodologies, we call that protocol, right? But at the core of this is the ethical relationships that develop out of research. Opening up and holding a space for voices, marginalized voices, to be heard. This is what we would traditionally, what we call now in the academy as resurgence, right, within Indigenous communities. And then finally, and probably maybe this is one of the most important ones, is that is challenging the structural power relationships, the systemic structural power relationships that exist within research. Even just coming to recognize what those are is critical to a new way of thinking about research. Okay, so let's just get into this just a little bit. I'm going to try and go through this fairly quickly, but I think it's critical for us to understand. Give me 1 second here. Critical to understand that Indigenous research methodologies comes out of an academic context. One of the key players in this, the seminal work that was done on this is a book called, I know it'll be backwards for you, but Decolonizing Methodologies by Linda Tahoi Smith. And I can send some references through maybe at the end if you're interested in that at all. But really, out of this academic context, the challenge came to understand research in a fundamentally different way, primarily through thinking about the ends and the purposes of the research, right? So it's not just enough to think about simply think about your project. What is it at the end of the project that's going to benefit the community where that information is drawn? And by the way, it doesn't matter if you belong to the community. There are a lot of Indigenous researchers who practice extractive research methodology. There are a lot of people within the intellectual, persons of difference communities, for example, that practice extractive methodologies. So how do we understand then Indigenous research methodologies in a way that allows us to see some of those things that I mentioned, like the power structures? Well, one of the things that we do is that we recognize that research is an ongoing relationship. It's not a one-stop shop. It's not a grab and go, right? You're committed to that community over the long term. If you do not build that in right into your research methodology from the very beginning, it's extractive. Okay, you know it, it's exploitive. So that ongoing relationality means that it has a longevity to it that goes beyond the scope of your project. You want to be the guarantor that relationship will continue. Secondly, it has to build capacity within the community. In other words, if you're not in drawing out the relationships and facilitating those relationships, if you are not building capacity within the community, in other words, training people within your community, whatever that happens to be, to do the research for themselves on their own terms, right? That's what we mean by capacity building. So you're not going in there, or you're not hiring an expert to go in there and do the research for them. You are building training mechanisms that will, in the end, allow them to tell their own history, their own memory. In other words, you're kind of working yourself out of a job, right? You're the one that's providing the opportunities for them to become self-determining researchers for their own community. Okay, so the third thing that I would say defines Indigenous research methodology is that it is for the purpose of self-determination. Self-determination is the ability to be whatever it is that the community is advocating for, right? The ability to be Métis, the freedom to be Métis, that's self-determination. The ability to be a person of difference with dignity and respect, right? Despite the fact that you might have a genetic, an intellectual, or a physical variation. Right? That's self-determination. The ability to be gay or lesbian or two-spirited and have that as a way of understanding how you relate to others. That is self-determination. Okay. And if your research agenda is not even in the nuts and bolts of it, right from the collecting of the information to the storing of the information to whatever form you're going to publish that information in, if it's not for the purposes of creating that uniqueness within that individual community, then you can say it's maybe not as methodologically sound as it could be as far as a partnership-based approach. So Joe's mentioned this a few times. I'll just summarize it like this, but research is a relationship. And that's a critical element. And also that knowledge is found in community. Knowledge as community is as critical as research in relationship, right? Because both are essential to understanding IRM. All right. Métis specifically, Joe's talked about this and given you a wonderful example of the case study. But let me just sort of draw it back a little bit and talk about the methodologies that are a part of this. Indigenous research methodology has become critical, or just sort of inseparable from what it means to be Métis in British Columbia. And part of that is because, as Joe mentioned, Métis are storytelling people. And I like to use the metaphor of beading. And every community, by the way, has a sort of a metaphorical representation of what, you know, their community represents. And it might be a really good way for you to sort of grab hold of this more relational approach to understanding how research can be done. So beading represents in Métis communities a history and a memory. It represents a story. It has authority within the community. It also, beading within the Métis, and you can see some examples of it here on my screen, but beading also is open. It's open to critique, to revision, to correction. Beading is also multi-perspectival. I mean, it means different things to different people. And that opens up conversation and dialogue. So storytelling is all of those things for Métis, and research in an Indigenous research methodology is part of that process, only a part of it. Right. And so if we recognize that the knowledge that we produce is always based upon ourselves in relation to each other, get this thought out of I'm a historian, by the way. So, I mean, you know, get this thought out of your head that knowledge is objective. Knowledge is always in relation to something else. Let me say that again. Knowledge is always in relation to something else, usually to an other, okay? And if we do that, I think that we will understand that the outcome or the aims, the objectives, so-called, of our research are intricately connected to the way in which we know, right? So we like to say this in Canada, with Indigenous ways of knowing, that this is, we're knowing not simply just the knowledge, but all of the relationships that go along with that knowledge. Human relations, natured relations, relationships with the sacred, okay? All of these things are tied up in the knowledge, in the production of knowledge itself. And so when you recognize that, knowledge then can be created specifically for the community and towards the community's well-being. Okay. And so what does this produce? Well, what this produces is an awareness, an acute awareness of the relationships that exist within research. Right? And you can't hide them. And as soon as you begin to understand those relationships, there is an obligation to live up to the responsibilities that come with understanding that relationship. As a researcher, it's way too easy to remove ourselves because it's more efficient, right? That's the number one reason why we do it. It's more efficient, but it's not more ethical. Right? And so understanding your relationship as a researcher in communication and conversation with the community, this is something that's critical, right? And so what this does, when you begin to understand all my relations in the research relationship, it reinforces the responsibilities and roles. And it allows for the community itself to begin to create these protocols that sometimes have been lost or forgotten, or maybe have not been practiced for a while. Okay, let me go through this really quickly because I know, how much time do I have left, Olivia?
You guys are good.
Okay, good. All right.
I thought that you guys had an hour and a half, and I thought you only had an hour.
Okay. Well, I don't want to belabor this. Let me just go through this quickly. I think I've got 3 more slides. Can you guys hang with me for 3 more? Give me a nod or a thumbs up. You're good. Okay. All right.
They're here for 40 more minutes. Sorry, everyone.
Well, I know, but I think these, you know, hey, I used to be a student once too, so I know what it's like to sit through these things without having interaction and engagement. So let me try. Sorry. So what are some of the principles of Indigenous research methodologies? Well, first of all, they're based primarily on what we'd like to call knowledge partnerships. Okay, knowledge partnerships. And these are partnerships that are interconnected. So they're not simply just based on whatever the subject matter is that you are looking at. So I noticed, for example, someone's doing a research project on Special Olympics, right? International Special Olympics. I noticed that someone else is doing a research project on I think it was health and the LGBTQ community somewhere. So, I mean, so whatever it is that you're researching, what you need to recognize when you establish these knowledge partnerships is that the relationships goes well beyond the narrowly confined research question that you've been asked to put together. Okay, and I'm going to maybe if we have time in the Q&A, I'll explain and share with you some of the challenges I've had explaining our IRM and the methodologies of relational research and community-based research to granting agencies and funding agencies and to regulatory bodies. It's an absolute nightmare because what happens is that as a researcher, you realize you are accountable. You're not accountable to your research, the funder, right? You're not that's not your primary mode of accountability. You're primarily accountable to the community itself. That's your prime. And so you have what we call a fiduciary obligation. Okay, what is a fiduciary obligation? You have an obligation as a researcher that's involved in a knowledge partnership to look out for the best interests of your, what we used to call research subject, right? You have an obligation to look out for the best interest of the partner, of the community that your research is coming out of. Okay, so in this way, you are not independent from that. You are an integral part of the research. Now, I'm a settler, okay? So I'm not an Indigenous, and I'm working in Indigenous research methodologies. So as a settler, I'm constantly reminding myself of my fiduciary obligation to the people that I'm in relationship with, in research relationships with. Okay? And it's very, very challenging. Okay, so in the case of Métis communities across the Pacific Northwest, this manifests itself not in strict genealogies, okay, which is typically how settler society has tried to define mixed ancestry communities. Okay, and all around the world, Canada is one of the few places around the globe that actually has defined rights for a mixed ancestry community. Okay, in Canada, we call those people Métis. In general, there are different specific, as Joe was pointing out, Métis communities all across Canada. But generally speaking, they come out of the historical experience of settler communities meeting Indigenous First Nations communities. Okay, and the product of that was this unique group of people called mixed ancestry or Métis. So what's challenging about relational research is that this cannot be boiled down to a simple genealogy, right? It's not just a matter of your ties to a particular lineage. Kinship networks are much more broad. Again, they define these relationships between land, people, other peoples, the sacred, right? And so kinship networks are much more challenging to research and to find, but they express that interconnectivity that is at the heart of Indigenous research methodology. Okay, second thing, protocol. So principles of IRM require you to define the relationship that you are going to have with your knowledge partners. Okay, this is the practice of good relationships and creating an ethical base for your research. Once again, the Canada Research Council can have as many, or whatever the governing body is for your research. They can have as many Social Sciences and Research Council of Canada. It can have as many guidelines as they want. But if they do not put you back into a relationship with the community that you are researching, it is not enough, right? It is not enough, because this flows from a basic respect that comes from being in a knowledge partnership, and it is grounded in the community. Your first responsibility is to the community itself, not to your research funder, right? I mean, this is and so in many ways, what you will find is when you take this approach, you have to educate the people that where your funding comes from. You have to be constantly reminding them of your research obligations and responsibilities, and they are not to the funder. They are to the community that you come from. So how does this work itself out in our research? Well, this works itself out with making sure that the knowledge that you're gaining, in whatever form that comes, the knowledge that you're gaining is honored. How do you honor that knowledge? Well, you don't simply just grab and go. You simply don't just say, I'm going to give you this if you give me that. That's transactional, right? This is not Indigenous research methodology. Nor is it, okay, I'm going to be your buddy for today, and then as soon as you give me the information, I'm going to take off and go, and you're never going to hear from me again. That's exploitive, right? Because you're using the research for your own gain. Now, how do we ensure that we're responsible to our, community-based researchers? We funnel the money, we funnel the resources, we funnel our expertise into the community itself, right? So community-based researchers are empowered themselves to honor the knowledge that's coming out of the community. What does this do? Well, it transforms, absolutely transforms the research process. And I think that's a really good thing, right? So we, as Joe mentioned, we have a lot of fun in community. And that fun in community is not, it's there because we have, cultural mores and practices that we like to do, but it also is there to build trust and helping each other understand that this is not just about this project or just about this research question, right? It's much broader than it's about a 10, 15, 20, 30, 50-year relationship that's going to be ongoing. And so as a researcher, you should ask yourself, what protocol am I putting in place that will give this research that I'm doing a legacy, right? What's the legacy that I'm leaving? All right, planning is the third thing. This does not happen by chance. You must become educated and informed. As I mentioned, a really good start is, right, Linda Smith's, there it is, decolonizing methodologies. That's a really good start, but there are so many good books now out on Indigenous research methodology, and all of these can apply to your specific areas of research in marginalized, stigmatized, and racialized communities. So planning then is not, it takes time, it takes resources, it is not efficient, it's messy, it's difficult. Relationships are hard. Wouldn't you agree? Give me a nod if you think that's right? Relationships are hard. It's much easier to create a statistical database out of something, right? Out of the census and do your analysis, and you don't have to get your hands muddied and dirtied in the messy lives of people. But the reality is that would only give you a very brief, simple, maybe even incomplete snapshot of what you want to find out or discover. And so, planning requires you to be adaptable. Métis people are adaptable. They're, as Joe mentioned, they're incredibly mobile. And so part of the beauty of our research, and I think it probably could be in yours as well, whatever community you're researching, is that what you begin to see and almost adopt as a part of your research methodology is the adaptability that comes out of the community itself. I'm very familiar with the special, what they call special needs. I call them persons of difference, right? People with genetic, physical, and intellectual variations. I'm very familiar with that community, and I do a lot of work within that community. And one of the things I'm constantly, I coach a lot of sports, and one of the things I'm constantly amazed at, and if I was to do more research, I would draw upon the adaptability of people with so-called special needs, right? Exceptionalities. Because I think that could be an integral part of the way in which you understand that community and come to know that community so you can express that in your research agenda. So for Métis people, this is primarily centered around mobility. Secondly, maybe predictability is too harsh a word here. I think maybe sustainability. If I was to revise, I'll go back and revise this. I think I'd put sustainability. Because you want to tap into the practices and procedures that are already existing within your community. Identify those, and they become kind of a basis for they become kind of the ground rules, right, for the research that you're doing. So in the case of our Métis research, this has been very instructive. Because what we've had to recognize is, as Joe says, is the many ways of being Métis, that that Métis have a polyvalent way of life, many different ways of expressing who they are over time and space. And to appreciate that and build that right into a research agenda. So guess what? What this means for us is that the so-called conclusions that we're going to draw from the end of our study are always tentative. They're always they're always open to alternative forms of interpretation, right? And they always, we're hopefully getting here, but they reflect the ingenuity of the community itself, right? So your conclusions might look very, very different in a context of if you apply Indigenous research methodology. Okay, as I mentioned, self-determination is the end goal of Indigenous research methodology. And I hope that for all of your communities that you're researching, that this would be one of the central foci of what you're thinking through and when you begin a research project. Wouldn't it be lovely if we said, up front, that this research is going, whatever the outcome of this research is, if your research question, right, wasn't, how have these, these practices led to this outcome, right? But what if we said, look, the outcome of my research, whatever it is going to be allow my community to live more full, vibrant, healthy lives, right? And wherever my research allows me to go, that's the pathway I'm going to be taking, right? And for us, that meant this idea of the freedom to be Métis. Now, there's a critical question that I've been skirting around. Some of you more seasoned researchers will know this, but there's a question I've been skirting around, and in some ways, it's the question of ownership, right? Like, who owns the research? For us, self-determined communities own the research. It's not mine to own, right? It's mine to share. And as the result of that, there are some self-determination works itself out in a variety of ways for us in the BC Métis Federation. One is culturally, right? That the owner, this is, in sort of common parlance now in academia, this is called data sovereignty or knowledge sovereignty, right? You probably, if you've read anything from the United Nations right now, or, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP, you'll realize that these terms are really becoming critical in areas of research. Right now, they're focused on primarily Indigenous research, but I can see a time when these are going to become important for almost any kind of research, right? So ownership of identity and ways of being Métis. For us, culturally, that is cultural capital, right? knowledge is the cultural capital. It is owned by the community to do with that, for that community to do with it what they will. Now, for many researchers, this is a particularly perplexing question. So, for example, when I do research for the government of Canada, for example, the government of Canada will try and get you to sign away the research. So you do, basically, you're doing the research for them. And when you submit your research at the end, or your research project, the ownership of that rests with the funding agency, right? We've had to deal with this just recently. We say no, unacceptable. The research is owned by the community and it remains with the community. And if you're going to use that cultural capital somewhere else in another setting, guess what? You owe it to the community, not only to ask for their consent, right? So consent is a major part of this. Not only ask for their consent, but also to compensate them for that knowledge. Knowledge everywhere in the knowledge economy, everywhere else we go, knowledge is power and people know it, and knowledge is currency, right? But for some reason, when we deal with racialized, marginalized, or stigmatized peoples, for whatever reason, knowledge becomes capital for somebody else, right? We think that's not right. Okay, economically then, how do we build capacity in ways that create self-sufficient communities? Socially, how do we reclaim and remake Métis communities in relationship to their location? Politically, how do we move towards self-government? Self-government might mean something different in different community contexts, right? But what does self-governing communities mean, especially, and this is where it's critical, the ability to make choices for their own future, right? In this case, Métis futures. And so if you want to adopt Indigenous research methodology or some aspect of it or element of it, what you have to recognize is that it is responsible, relevant, respective. Here's a key term, right? Non-oppressive. It is not coercive. If you've got to coerce information or data sets out of your community, you haven't established the proper relations, right? If you sit down with somebody and you have to ply them with, alcohol or whatever it is to get, it's just not, you can't do it. And non-oppressive community-based research can be then these acts of self-determination. You can create a research agenda where self-determination becomes the outcome of the research project itself. Okay, all right. So I loved what one researcher said, so I've borrowed some of her words, but community-based research, this is Indigenous-based research, right? Indigenous methodologies, is intelligence resistance in sustainable ways. So there's an element here, once again, of this resurgence, right? You are empowering your community that you've come into relationship with and form these knowledge partnerships to decide for themselves the kinds of relationships they want to engage in. That's self-determination. Okay, all right. So how many more slides do I have? Oh, I'm on my last slide. Everyone give a big hurrah. Okay, yes, good, thank you. Thank you for that, Paula, I appreciate that. All right, so as Joe mentioned, Métis are a storytelling people. And so this is a wonderful map by one of them, Métis artist by the name of Lisa Shepherd. And as you can see, what she's done, and it's wonderful, is that she's traced the trading routes that were a part of the original fur trade in Canada. She's traced those and used Métis symbols and icons to beading to define that history and memory, right? And so when you think about community-based research, think about a few things. First of all, you have to recognize that it is not efficient. If you want efficiency, stick with quantitative, right? I mean, if that's your goal, stick with it, because it will get you what you want, but it's probably not going to serve the community well. So if you're coming into your research with any kind of a social justice bent or understanding that you think you're serving the community that you're researching, whether you're a part of that community or not, if you're not willing to be patient, disciplined, and respectful, then it's not going to work, right? Because it's messy and it takes time, and relationship building is about trusting and building those trusting relationships. And that's, by the way, right all the way through the research process, from the beginning to the end. Secondly, I would say that the community-based research is a partnership. It's a knowledge partnership. And it's a partnership not between you and your funder. It's a partnership between you and the research community. But you have to keep in mind that you are also being funded by somebody, right? But be aware that that's a very complex relationship. It's very difficult to prioritize the relationship with the community that you're serving, especially when you've got funding agencies or regulatory bodies that are pushing you in a different direction. Okay, outcomes. That's what you'll get. Give me the outcome. Okay. Thirdly, IRM and community-based research in particular is about the long term. It's not about the short term. Lifelong, sustainable, I would even say intergenerational relationships that you can establish. And by the way, this is the joy of IRM. I mean, you start to realize the depth and the scope of the research project that you're engaging in. And the narrow, sort of limited research question that you have, most of you, I noticed, are either in your undergraduate or maybe in your MA or finishing up your MA degree. What you'll start to recognize is that these aren't simply just, papers. These are dissertations that you're after, right? And you're engaged in a much larger research project that can last you a lifetime, not just a 6 or 8 month period. So let me just go back finally to talking a little bit about the beading metaphor, because IRM can be very frustrating, but it can be extremely rewarding. And it can feel like searching for a needle, and needles were used to put the beads on the thread to, weave through and create a pattern. But recognize that the needle is necessary to pull the thread through the beads of memory that you're going to be looking at, whatever that research happens to be. And important narratives are waiting for you, right? They're not discovered. They're waiting for you to be known, right? And when you begin to bring those together, those individual beads into a meaningful pattern in relation to and in conversation with the people that you've drawn that information out, what you will find is a completely different research environment, a completely different research ecosystem. And what is that ecosystem? Okay, I don't have this on my slide, so you might have to write this down, right? But what is it? Number one, it's open to possibility. Wow, wouldn't that be awesome if our research was open to possibility? I mean, I just love that. Secondly, that we would start to see new patterns emerging from the old. These are critical. Like, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Omi Baba's book On Culture, but he's a chapter in there on how does newness enter the world. I'd encourage you to read that if you don't. But how do we grow out of this sort of understanding that, yeah, we're entrenched and mired in old patterns, but there's something new that can come out of it. Thirdly, that there is an emergence in research. Research isn't an end goal, it's an emergence. where we recognize, where we learn to know and to unknow what we think we are so-called discovering, right? Fourthly, you can, as a research center, put at the very center of your research, well-being. Okay, that well-being can be the core of what you do, and it's not just about the research question. It goes far beyond that. And then finally, right, what I think we can also come out of this when we search for a needle in the dark, that we can weave our stories together in and through. What we begin to recognize is that it brings about restoration, renewal, rejuvenation, right? Repatriation. These are the kinds of terms, I think, that I would like to see us becoming more familiar with. Now, all of this to say that we are storytellers. Métis people aren't just storytellers. We all are. Métis have a particular way of telling a story. And your job, as Joe was saying, is to find your particular community's voice and to articulate that as clearly as possible. Now, Richard Kearney wrote a book called On Stories, and I'm going to end with that. He says this, he says, stories are what make our lives worth living. They are what make our condition human. Let me say that again, right? Stories are what make our lives worth living. They are what make our condition human. My hope is that you find the story of your community and you tell it with compassion and you tell it in cooperation with that community. All right, that's it. I'm going to stop screen sharing, and we have a few minutes, I think, for some Q&A.